So in this video, we're going to take a look at Daniel chapter 6. Daniel 6 is a really fun chapter to examine. Of course, a lot of people are very familiar with the story about Daniel in the lion's den. It's a story that is oftentimes told to children. It's a very provocative chapter that excites the imagination of Daniel standing amongst the lions. But we're going to dig a little deeper into the text and some of the issues that are raised by a critical historical approach to looking at Daniel and the purpose of this chapter for its author. So, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3, Daniel will have his loyalty to God tested. So, the three friends of Daniel are tested publicly, but Daniel is going to be tested here for his private devotion. Overall, what it seems to be kind of asking about or addressing is how should a Jew who's living in the diaspora or under foreign rule persevere when they are commanded to disobey God's law? So, technically, there aren't Jews really until kind of a later time, but when we think about the people of Judah living in exile, so someone like a Daniel, he is living outside of the land of Palestine, so kind of like much later when Jews, as they are called later, lived in outside of the land of Palestine in the diaspora. And so when they're living under foreign rule, how do they maintain their allegiance to God and to their kind of ancestral practices, or to what they understand to be what distinguishes Jews from non-Jews? So how are they to keep to all of this? So the story here of Daniel is kind of encouraging towards that. Now, again, the book of Daniel is most likely written in the 2nd century BC, and it's probably happening during the time when many of the people of this faith are living inside Judea, but they are under the influence and domination of Antiochus Epiphanes. So in some ways, the story of Daniel in the lion's den is going to be a kind of an encouragement for how those who are having to suffer under Antiochus ought to respond. So God is going to be present among those with integrity and faith in the midst of danger. And their experience of suffering and dealing with oppression will sometimes lead rulers to acknowledge God's sovereignty. And so that seems to be quite an important thing in the book of Daniel, that you have someone like a Nebuchadnezzar who is great, and he comes to recognize something about Israel's God. But then you have other individuals who are not going to recognize Israel's God. So what kind of foreign rulers are going to do this? And a lot depends, or some depends, on the way in which those who follow God or keep to God's law handle themselves. And so, but throughout all this, it's going to recognize that God is sovereign. He's sovereign over the non-Jewish or the Gentile rulers over Jews. So the story is set during the reign of Darius. We don't know if this is Darius the first, but Darius the Mede, according to Daniel 5:31. And he reigns from 522 to 486 BCE. So we'll begin here by looking at Daniel 6 and 1 through 9, and I'll read that. So it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps stationed throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, including Daniel. To these the satraps gave account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Soon Daniel distinguished himself above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. So the presidents and the satraps tried to find grounds for complaint against Daniel in connection with the kingdom. But they could find no grounds for complaint or any corruption, because he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. The men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So the presidents and satraps conspired and came to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish this edict and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and edict. Okay, so some things here about these verses. Daniel's innocence is stressed a number of times, so it keeps kind of repeating this kind of on the lips of his detractors, that there is no complaint, there are no grounds, there's no corruption. So this stressing of Daniel's innocence in all of this. Verse 1 seems to reflect the activity of Darius's first structuring of the empire, Medo-Persian Empire, into 20 satrapies. Though as many as 120 of these satrapies are not known. So it says 120 in verse 1. We don't know that there were that many satrapies, but we do know from other literature that at least 20 or more were done. So it seems to reflect some of that activity. Maybe the author is only thinking about regional administrators, and that's why he talks about 120. So it kind of moves down farther into these satraps and the different other kinds of administrators that would have been used. There's also no evidence of presidents or the triumvir that's referred in verse 2. So we don't really have that. 3 presidents, we don't know where this is coming from. Now, just because we don't know where it's coming from doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but we don't seem to have any kind of literary or archaeological evidence to back up that this was the way in which the empire had been organized. So having an excellent spirit in verse 3 is not referring to his ability to interpret ministry or mysteries, but refers to his skill and reliability. So, an excellent spirit, can be something that describes how Daniel can interpret visions or dreams. But here it's focused in on his administrative skill and that he's reliable, he's not corrupt. So Daniel's peers and subordinates, really, if you start talking down to all the different people who are involved, counselors and governors, conspire against Daniel, and really they're conspiring against Darius as well. They're trying to set Darius up to put something down in order to trap Daniel, although Darius doesn't know this. So we're not quite sure what it is that verse 7 is indicating is supposed to happen. That whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. So is it pray to or is it petition to the king? So are they expecting that there should only be worshiping the king? So in other words, are people not to pray to anyone in addition to whatever else that they are already worshiping or praying to? So it seems a bit odd or somewhat kind of unimaginable that there aren't going to be any other types of prayers So whether or not worshiping the king is the issue here. So in other words, seeing the king as someone to be seen as a god. And so this issue about seeing rulers as gods, it's interesting that it's not really a activity that was common amongst the Greeks at the earlier stages of its empire. But as the Greek Empire came into more Eastern cultures, or into places like Egypt and farther out into the East, they encountered they encountered groups that did have a tradition of associating their rulers with gods. And so to accommodate those practices, we find Greek rulers who are willing to accept, as it were, some kind of connection with the divine, being seen as divine themselves. And so they accommodate that. So why is the edict set for only 30 days? It's not really kind of clear why 30 days is set, why that's just kind of thrown out, but it's a trial period. And so maybe it's seen as a short time. So someone might be saying, okay, Daniel, hey, just do it for a little bit of time. But Daniel is not even going to do it for just a mere 30 days. He is not going to back off from worshiping his God. So we don't know about these lion pits or the den of lions, or if it's a pit. And what do we know really about Persians using this as some kind of punishment? So again, kind of the evidence for this is a bit kind of curious. There is no evidence of lions being kept really in this kind of way, although they were kept in order to hunt. And there were lions that were kept in cages. But this idea of being used as a form of punishment, we don't know. So this would be the only kind of indicator that this idea was around, that it could be used for punishment. We maybe wondered if Daniel's pit might be something that alludes to Joseph and Jeremiah. So other videos I have talked about this kind of connection with the Joseph story, the Daniel and the Joseph story connecting. Here, Joseph was thrown into a pit, and now here Daniel is thrown into a pit. So again, it may be the author who is picking up these themes from a great story and reutilizing them to talk about another kind of heroic character. All right, we'll move now to verses 10 through 18. Although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. The conspirators came and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to anyone, divine or human, within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions? The king answered, the thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they responded to the king, Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the interdict you have signed, but he is saying his prayers 3 times a day. When the king heard the charge, he was very much distressed. He was determined to save Daniel, and until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. Then the conspirators came to the king and said to him, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, that no edict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you. So then verse 17, a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No food was brought to him, and sleep fled from him. All right, so this great scene of being thrown into the lion's pit. So Daniel's adversaries then report that he is intentionally defying the king's order. Daniel does not hide his devotion, but continues to pray and praise God. Kneeling in prayer developed really in the post-exilic period. So this type of activity for prayer. What Daniel is asking of God is really what the author's audience may be asking God, to be merciful. So in verse 11 of this, the Spirit found Daniel seeking mercy before his God. And so it may be that the author of Daniel's audience, who are living at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, are also seeking God's mercy while they are being tormented and harassed by Antiochus, while he is outlawing, following the Mosaic law, while he's taking over the temple. They may be asking for God's mercy in their situation to release them, to protect them, to deliver them. So Darius then is kind of led into a trap through a rhetorical question. So they've asked the question about it, did you not sign? Of course, they know the answer to it. They know that he did sign it, and so this is how he's entrapped. So Darius then is compelled to abide by his edict, 14 through 18. Darius is depicted then as caring for Daniel, but not so caring for the agitator's family in verse 24. So we're going to later see what happens to them and their family. But here, for Daniel, he is quite caring. He doesn't really want this to happen to Daniel. It's interesting that it is Darius and not Daniel who raises the possibility or expectation of Daniel's God's rescue. So, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they are kind of tested and given the opportunity to do what the king desires or commands, they take a position. Well, we don't know if God will rescue us, but we're not going to turn away. In other words, they're going to they're the ones who are voicing their trust in God. So we don't really have a speech from Daniel who states it, but we've got it now from Darius, that may your God whom you faithfully serve deliver you. We're not quite sure about the sealing of the stone may have. I guess by the signet, this idea of sealing it so that it can't be broken, that someone can't come in and rescue Daniel. So we get the kind of stone that is wrought over, and maybe it's showing this is backed with the authority of the king. So if you break this seal, then you'll have to answer to the king for doing this, or no one but the king should have authority to break the seal. That would then be able to move the stone. All right, now let's look here at verses 19 through 22. Then at break of day, the king got up and hurried to the den of lions. When he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out anxiously to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel then said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no wrong." So we'll just stop there for a second with this discovering that Daniel is okay. So does Darius then believe that Daniel could have survived? So we come this, he cries out, maybe with the expectation of it. So, he seems to be quite anxious. Note that Darius in verse 20 and in 26 uses the language of Jews, particularly diaspora Jews, for God, the living God. That's a way that Jews talked about their God as a contrast to the gods of non-Jews, who they saw really as dead gods, as no gods. So the idea of the living God. And it's also this living God who resists foreign nations. And it was also used for the Canaanite god Baal. So it's kind of interesting that there are some Canaanite backgrounds to the book of Daniel. And so that this one expression about the living God is used for Baal is also used for Israel's God. Daniel's wish that the non-Jewish king, or the non-Israelite king, if you like, might live forever, is unique in Daniel, but does occur in Nehemiah 2:3. So usually God is described as the one who lives forever. So to talk about an emperor living forever is kind of a unique aspect. Just as a celestial being was with Daniel's friends in the furnace, so this one like a son of man, so we also have a celestial being, an angel, who is with Daniel while he is in the pit. So in other words, these indicators of divine presence. Some being is there to show that God is with his people, whether an individual person or with the friends. The living God then is able to preserve life even when death seems certain. So there's a comment from Siao on this. So it should seem certain that the lions would eat up Daniel. That seems like it should happen, but that does not. And so God is able to preserve life in whatever circumstances that the righteous might find themselves in. All right, let's just look here now at verses 23 through 24. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king gave a command, and those who had accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lion overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So it's not that the lions weren't hungry, that Daniel didn't get eaten. So the reason why Daniel was not harmed by the lions is because he trusted in God. So, but the author of Daniel surely knows that harm by those in power can still come to those who are faithful to God. So, I mean, the claim here is not that anybody who trusts in God won't be harmed. Sure, the author of Daniel knows that there are people who trust in God and who do get harmed. It's interesting that the Jewish author living in the 1st century CE, Josephus, thinks Daniel's accusers thought the lions had been fed, and that is why they didn't eat him. So he's got a little bit of extra to this story than what we have in our accounts of it. As Siao points out in his commentary, a little commentary on Daniel, the narrative makes Daniel's integrity and God's sovereignty over life really the central points. And so again, this should be understood as the big central message for Daniel. Is the righteous need to demonstrate integrity in the midst of suffering, and to, despite what suffering might indicate, God is still sovereign over all things. The image of a king's violence to those he sees as untrustworthy, so this idea of throwing, the conspirators and their family, even their children, their wives, all into this pit. This image is common both in Old and New Testament. So whether or not such a thing actually occurred but it's really kind of beside the point that it fits the image of ruthless rulers. So did Darius get rid of all the administrators and their family? So in other words, were there 120 here? Men plus families fit into the same pit? Because that's what we were told, that there was 120. Maybe he just has some of these accusers. Or maybe it's a long day and different accusers are thrown in at different times and the lions just keeps eating them up. We don't know. Maybe it's probably more like hyperbole here. All these people being thrown and eaten immediately. So it's a very dramatic kind of image that is used. All right, now verses 25 through 28, and we'll conclude this. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the whole world, "May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. For he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. All right, a couple of things here about this decree. Darius decrees the worship of God. Darius' letter to all peoples goes farther than the one by Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4, verses 1 through 3, in that it not only praises God, but requires others to do so. So there's this kind of development here that goes on. So Darius is, making, as it were, some kind of law in his kingdom that Israel's God should be praised. Of course, we don't have any evidence that this, happened. So this is part of this particular story. So Darius's doxology is evidence of the Jewish expectation that the nations will come to worship God. So what we see here in verses 26 and 27, it's almost kind of like a hymn. This doxology is this expectation. All nations will recognize him. So his dominion shall never be destroyed. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall never end. And so everyone should recognize the greatness of Israel's God's kingdom. Some have wondered maybe if this whole episode, this entire story, might actually have been inspired by Psalm 2, because in Psalm 2, the psalmist kind of laughs, as it were, at the nations who can conspire, who plot in vain against God, and God basically laughs at this. You think that you can do things to resist me. These things can't happen, but instead what God is going to do is he exercises his wrath against the nations. He recognizes those that are his, and that even all the nations are his. The ends of the earth are his possessions. And so the call in Psalm 2 is for kings and rulers to be wise, to be warned. So in here we have Daniel's story is going to encourage Darius to be wise, and Darius is wise. He recognizes Israel's God for what he is able to do. So Daniel prospers, and this takes place during the time of Darius the Mede. So basically, we're looking at somewhere between 522 to 486 BCE, and through into Cyrus the Persian, who is from 560 to 530 BCE. So we're talking about quite a bit of time, or length of time. I'm not sure that it's all through Cyrus's time, but it's during quite a bit of time. And that's a kind of a quick sketch and go through of Daniel chapter 6.